Hi everyone, it's Miss LaChance back again with another read aloud video. Today we are going to be reading chapters 22 through 28 of the book Flora and Ulysses, or the full title is The Illuminated Adventures of Flora and Ulysses. I actually found out that I had been pronouncing Holy Bagumba wrong. The real pronunciation is Bagumba instead of Bagumba, like what I've been saying. And if you're confused as to what I'm talking about, Holy Bagumba is actually something that Flora says when she gets surprised. It's a phrase from one of her favorite comics, The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. Last time we were reading, Ulysses had actually typed out some poetry on Tootie Tickham's typewriter, and it said, "I love your round head, the brilliant green, the watching blue, these letters, this world, you. I am very, very hungry." In chapter 21, called Poetry, Flora, Tootie, and William Spiver were actually talking about this poetry that Ulysses had typed out. They were trying to figure out what it meant, and then they were interrupted by Flora's mom yelling, "Flora Belle!" to signal her to come back to the house because her father was there. And in chapter 22, called A Giant Ear, we're finally going to be introduced to Flora's father, George Buckman. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 22, again, is called A Giant Ear. Her father was standing on the top step in front of the open door. He was wearing a dark suit and a tie and a hat with a brim, even though it was Saturday and summertime. Flora's father was an accountant at the firm Flinton, Floston, and Frick. Flora wasn't sure, but she thought it was possible that her father was the world's loneliest man. He didn't even have Incandesto and Dolores to keep him company anymore. "Hi, Pop," she said. "Flora," said her father. He smiled at her and then he sighed. "I'm not ready yet." "Oh, that's okay," said her father. He sighed again. "I'll wait." He walked with Flora into the living room. He sat down on the couch. He took off his hat and balanced it on his knee. "Are you in the house now, George?" Flora's mother shouted from the kitchen. "Is Flora with you?" "I'm inside," shouted Flora's father. "Flora's with me." The clack, clack, clack of the typewriter echoed through the house. Silverware rattled, and then there was silence. "What are you doing, George?" her mother shouted. "I'm sitting on the couch, Phyllis. I'm waiting for my daughter." Flora's father moved his hat from his left knee to his right knee and then back to his left knee again. Ulysses shifted underneath Flora's pajamas. "What are you two going to do today?" Flora's mother shouted. "I don't know, Phyllis." "I can hear you perfectly well, George," said Flora's mother as she came out into the living room. "You don't need to shout." "Flora, what have you got under your pajama top?" "Nothing," said Flora. "Is it that squirrel?" "No," said Flora. "What squirrel?" said Flora's father. "Don't lie to me," said her mother. "Okay," said Flora. "It's the squirrel. I'm keeping him." "I knew it. I knew you were hiding something. Listen to me. That squirrel is diseased. You are engaging in dangerous behavior." Flora turned away. She had a superhero under her pajamas. She didn't have to listen to her mother, or anybody else for that matter. A new day was dawning, a girl with a superhero kind of day. "I'm going to change now," she said. "This will not work, Flora Belle," said her mother. "That squirrel is not staying." "What squirrel?" said Flora's father again. Flora went halfway up the stairs and then she stopped. She stood on the landing. The criminal element suggested that anyone truly invested in fighting crime, in besting criminals, should learn to listen carefully. All words at all times, true or false, whispered or shouted, are clues to the workings of the human heart. Listen, you must. If you care to understand anything at all, become a giant ear. This is what the criminal element suggested, and this is what Flora intended to do. She pulled Ulysses out from the underneath of her pajama top. "Sit on my shoulder," she whispered to him. Ulysses climbed up her shoulder. Listen, she said. He nodded. Flora felt brave and capable, standing there on the landing with her squirrel on her shoulder. Do not hope, she whispered. Instead, observe. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She held herself absolutely still. She became a giant ear. And what Flora, the giant ear, heard was astonishing. Chapter 23 is called Enter the Villain. And before I start reading, I want you to make a prediction as to who Ulysses' villain might be, since he is a superhero after all. George, said Flora's mother, we have a problem. Your daughter has become emotionally attached to a diseased squirrel. How's that? Said Flora's father. There's a squirrel, said her mother, speaking more slowly now, as if she were pointing at each word as she said it. There's a squirrel, repeated her father. The squirrel is not well. There's an unwell squirrel? There's a sack in the garage, and a shovel. Okay, said Flora's father. There's a sack and a shovel in the garage. At this point, there was a very long silence. I need you to put the squirrel out of its misery, said Flora's mother. How's that? Said her father. For the love of Pete, George, shouted her father. Put the squirrel in the sack and then hit him over the head with the shovel. Flora's father gasped. Flora gasped too. She was surprised at herself. The ladies in her mother's romance novels put their hands on their bosoms and gasped. But Flora was not a gasper. She was a cynic. Flora's father said, I don't understand. Flora's mother cleared her throat. She uttered the blood-soaked words again. She said them louder. She said them more slowly. You put that squirrel in the sack, George. You hit the squirrel over the head with the shovel. She paused. And then, she said, you used the shovel to bury the squirrel. Put the squirrel in a sack? Hit the squirrel over the head with a shovel? Said Flora's father in a squeaky, despairing voice. Oh, Phyllis! Oh, Phyllis, no! Yes, said Flora's mother. It's the humane thing to do. Flora understood that she had made a mistake in thinking that William Spiver was anybody important. Everything was coming into a sharp, terrifying focus. The story was starting to make sense. Ulysses was a superhero, probably, and Phyllis Buckman was his arch nemesis, definitely. Wholly unanticipated occurrences. Here's a picture of George Buckman conversing with his ex-wife, and as you can see, Flora's feet are at the top of the stairs, and she is being a giant ear listening in on their conversation. Chapter 24 is called Stalked, Chased, Threatened, Poisoned, etc. He should have been shocked, but he wasn't. Not really. It was a sad fact of his existence as a squirrel that there was always someone, somewhere, who wanted him dead. In his short life, Ulysses had been stalked by cats, attacked by raccoons, and shot at with BB guns, slingshots, and a bow and arrow. Granted, the arrow was made of rubber, but still, it had hurt. He had been shouted at, threatened, and poisoned. He had been flung ears over tail by the stream of water issuing from a garden hose, turned to a full force. Once at the public picnic grounds, a small girl had tried to beat him to death with her enormous teddy bear, and last fall, a pickup truck had run over his tail. Truthfully, the possibility of getting hit over the head with a shovel didn't seem that alarming. Life was dangerous, particularly if you were a squirrel. In any case, he wasn't thinking about dying. He was thinking about poetry. That is what Tootie said he had written. Poetry. He liked that word. Its smallness, its density, the way it rose up at the end as if it had wings. Poetry. Don't worry, said Flora. You're a superhero. This malfeasance will be stopped. Ulysses dug his claws into Flora's pajamas to keep his balance on her shoulder. Malfeasance, said Flora again. Poetry. thought Ulysses. Chapter 25 is called Seal Blubber. Flora's father's car seat smelled like butterscotch and ketchup, and Flora was in the back seat where the smell of butterscotch and ketchup was the most powerful. She had a Bootsy Boots shoebox with Ulysses in it on her lap, and she was feeling carsick, even though the car wasn't even moving yet. She was also feeling the tiniest bit overwhelmed. Things in general were pretty confusing. For instance, here was Ulysses, sitting in a shoebox, knowing that there was a shovel in the trunk of the car, and that the man driving the car had been instructed to whack him over the head with a shovel, and the squirrel didn't look worried or afraid. He looked happy. And then there was Flora's mother, the person who had given Flora the shoebox. To protect your little friend on his journey, we'll just put his washcloths in here as a comfy blanket. She was standing at the door, smiling and waving goodbye to them, as if she weren't truly a murder-planning arch-nemesis. Talk about the darkness of 10,000 hands. Nothing was as it seemed. Flora looked down at the squirrel. Of course, he was not what he seemed either, and that was a good thing, an incandesto thing. Flora felt a shiver of belief, of possibility pass through her. Her parents had no idea what kind of squirrel they were dealing with. Her father put the car in reverse. As he backed out of the driveway, Flora saw William Spiver standing in Tootie's front yard. He was looking up at the sky. As he turned his head slowly in the direction of the car, his glasses flashed in the sun. Tootie appeared. She was waving one of the pink gloves as if it were a flag of surrender. "Stop the car!" she shouted. "Step on the gas," Flora said to her father. She did not want to talk to Tootie. And she definitely did not want to talk to William Spiver. She didn't want to see herself reflected in his dark glasses. She had her own thoughts about the random and confusing nature of the universe. She didn't need his, too. Also, she was in a hurry. There was a murder to stop, a superhero to mentor, villains to vanquish, darkness to eradicate. She couldn't waste time trading stupid thoughts with William Spiver. "Florabelle!" shouted William Spiver, almost as if he were reading her mind. "I've had some interesting thoughts." He ran toward the car and fell into the bushes. "Great Aunt Tootie!" he shouted. "I need your assistance." "What in the world is going on?" said her father. He slammed on the brakes. "It's just a temporarily blind boy," said Flora, "and Mrs. Tickham from next door. She's his aunt, his great aunt. Never mind. It doesn't make any difference. Keep going." But it was too late. Tootie had helped William Spiver out of the bushes, and the two of them were walking toward the car. William Spiver was smiling. "Hello," her father called out to them. "I'm George Buckman. How do you do?" Flora's father introduced himself to everyone all the time, even if the person was someone he had already met. It was an annoying and extremely persistent habit. "Hello, sir," said William Spiver. "I am William Spiver. I would like to speak to your daughter, Florabelle." "I don't have time to talk to you right now, William Spiver," said Flora. "Great Aunt Tootie, can you assist me? Will you take me to Flora's side of the vehicle? Please excuse me while I escort this extremely disturbed and neurotic child to the other side of the car," said Tootie. "Certainly, certainly," said Flora's father. And then he said to absolutely no one, "George Buckman, how do you do?" Flora sighed. She looked down at Ulysses. Considering the human being she was surrounded by, believing in a squirrel seemed like an increasingly reasonable plan of action. "I wanted to apologize," said William Spiver, who was now standing beside her window. "For what?" said Flora. "It wasn't the worst poetry I'd ever heard." "Oh," said Flora. "Also, I'm sorry that I wouldn't take my glasses off when you asked me to." "Take them off now, then," said Flora. "I can't," said William Spiver. "They've been glued to my head by evil forces beyond my control." "You lie," said Flora. "Yes. No. No, I don't." "I do. I'm engaging in hyperbole. It seems as if the glasses had been glued to my head." And that word hyperbole, I think we've talked about this before in 3rd grade, actually means an exaggeration. So William Spiver is exaggerating right now. He's bending the truth a little bit, as we would say. He lowered his voice. "Actually, I'm afraid that if I take my glasses off, the whole world will unravel." "That's stupid," said Flora. "There are bigger things to worry about. For instance," Flora realized that she was going to say something to William Spiver that she hadn't intended to say. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. "Do you know what an arch nemesis is?" she whispered. "Of course I do," William Spiver whispered back. "Right," said Flora. "Well, Ulysses has got one. It's my mother." William Spiver's eyebrow rose up above his dark glasses. Flora was pleased to note that he looked properly surprised and shocked. "Speaking of Ulysses," said Tootie, "I have some poetry that I would like to recite to him." "Are you sure that now is the time for a poetry recitation?" said William Spiver. Ulysses sat up straighter in his bootsy boots shoebox. He looked at Tootie. He nodded. "I was moved by your poetry," said Tootie to the squirrel. Ulysses puffed out his chest. "And I have some poetry that I would like to recite to you in honor of the recent, transformations in your life." Tootie put a hand on her chest. "This is Rilke," she said. "You sent out beyond your recall. Go to the limits of your longing, embody me, flare up like flame, and make big shadows I can move in." Ulysses stared up at Tootie, his bright eyes. "Flare up like flame?" said Flora's father from the front seat. "That is moving. Yes, that is quite lovely, flaring up like flame. Thank you so much. We have to be on our way now. But will you return?" said William Spiver. Flora looked up and saw William Spiver's words hanging on the air above him like a small, tattered flag. "But will you return?" "I'm just spending the afternoon with my father, William Spiver," she said. "It's not like I'm heading off to the South Pole." Terrible Things Can Happen to You had done an extensive piece on what to do if you were stranded at the South Pole. Their advice could be summed up in 3 simple words: eat, seal, blubber. It was astonishing, really, what people could live through. Flora felt cheered up all of a sudden, just thinking about eating seal blubber and doing impossible things, surviving when the odds were against her and her squirrel. They would figure out a way to outwit the arch nemesis. They would triumph over the shovel and the sack, and they would triumph together like Dolores and Incandesto. "I'm glad," said William Spiver. "I'm glad that you're not going to the South Pole, Flora Belle." Flora's father cleared his throat. "George Buckman," he said. "How do you do?" "It was nice to meet you, sir," said William Spiver. "Remember those words," said Tootie. "Flare up like flame," said Flora's father. "I was speaking to the squirrel," said Tootie. "Of course," said Flora's father. "My apologies. The squirrel." "I will see you again," said William Spiver. "Beware the arch nemesis," said Flora. "I will see you again," said William Spiver. "We're off to fight evil," said Flora as her father backed out of the car driveway. William Spiver waved at the car. "I will see you again." He seemed so stuck on the idea of seeing her again that Flora didn't have the heart to tell him that he was waving in the wrong direction. Chapter 26 is called Spies Don't Cry. Flora's father was a careful driver. He kept his left hand at 10 o'clock on the steering wheel and his right hand at 2. So I want you to imagine your hands are on the wheel of a car, okay? 10 o'clock would be up here because this is 12 o'clock. And it goes 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay? And 2 o'clock would be right over here since this is 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and then 2 o'clock. So he's driving the car very safely with 2 hands on the wheel. He never took his eyes off the road. He did not go fast. Speed, her father often said. That is what will kill you. That and taking your eyes off the road. Never, ever take your eyes off the road. Pop, said Flora, I need to talk to you. Okay, said her father. He kept his eyes on the road. About what? That sack and that shovel. What sack? Said her father. What shovel? It occurred to Flora that her father would make an excellent spy. He never really answered questions. Instead, when asked a question, he simply responded with a nifty sidestep or a question of his own. For instance, when her parents were getting their divorce, Flora had a conversation with her father that went something like this. Flora, are you and Mom getting divorced? Flora's father, who says we're getting divorced? Flora, Mom. Flora's father, is that what she said? Flora, that's what she said. Flora's father, I wonder why she said that. And then he started to cry. Spies probably didn't cry, but still. There's a sack and a shovel in the trunk of your car, Pop, said Flora. Is there? Said her father. I saw you put them in there. It's true. I did put a sack and a shovel in the trunk of the car. The criminal element said that it was a good idea to engage in relentless, open-ended questioning. If you question with enough ferocity, people are sometimes surprised into answering questions that they do not intend to answer. When in doubt, question. Question more. Question faster. Why? Said Flora. I intend to dig a hole, said her father. For what? Said Flora. A thing that I'm going to bury. What thing are you going to bury? A sack. Why are you burying a sack? Because your mother asked me to. Why did she ask you to bury a sack? Her father tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. He stared straight ahead. Why did she ask me to bury a sack? Why did she ask me to bury a sack? That's a good one. Hey, I know. Do you want to get something to eat? What? Said Flora. How about some lunch? Said her father. For the love of Pete, said Flora. Or some breakfast? How about we stop and eat a meal? Any meal? Flora sighed. The criminal element advised stalling, delaying, and obfuscation of every possible sort when it came to dealing with a criminal. Her father wasn't a criminal, not exactly, but he had been enlisted in the service of villainy. Basically, he was in cahoots with an arch-nemesis. So maybe it would be good to stall, to delay the inevitable showdown by going into a restaurant. Besides, the squirrel was hungry, and he would need to be strong for the battle ahead. Okay, said Flora. Okay, sure. Let's eat. We have 2 more chapters that we're going to be reading today, chapter 27 and 28. And we're on chapter 27, and it's called The World in All Its Smelly Glory. Okay, sure, let's eat. What wonderful words those are, thought Ulysses. Let's eat. Talk about poetry. The squirrel was happy. He was happy because he was with Flora. He was happy because he had the words from Tootie's poem flowing through his head and heart. He was happy because he was going to be fed soon. And he was happy because he was, well, happy. He climbed out of the shoebox and put his front paws on the door and his nose on the open window. He was a squirrel riding in a car on a summer day with someone he loved. His whiskers and nose were in the breeze, and there were so many smells. Overflowing trash cans, just cut grass, sun-warmed patches of pavement, the loamy richness of dirt, earthworms, loamy smelling too, often difficult to distinguish from the smell of dirt. Dog, more dog, dog again. Oh, dogs, Small dogs, large dogs, foolish dogs, the torturing of dogs was the one reliable pleasure of a squirrel's existence. The tang of fertilizer, a faint whiff of birdseed, something baking, the hint of nuttiness, pecan, acorn, the small, apologetic, don't-mind-me odor of a mouse, and the ruthless stench of a cat. Cats were terrible. Cats were never to be trusted. Never. The world in all its smelly glory, in all its treachery and joy and nuttiness, washed over Ulysses, ran through him, filled him. He could smell everything. He could smell the blue of the sky. He wanted to capture it. He wanted to write it down. He wanted to tell Flora. He turned and looked at her. "Keep your eyes open for malfeasance," she said to him. Ulysses nodded. The words from Tootie's poem sounded in his head. Flare up like a flame. Yes, he thought, that's what I'll do. I'll flare up like flame and I'll write it all down. Chapter 28 is called The Giant Donut. "You'll have to leave the squirrel in the car," said Flora's father as he pulled into the parking lot of the Giant Donut. "No," said Flora, "it's too hot." "I'll leave the windows open," said her father. "Someone will steal him." "You think someone would steal him?" Her father sounded doubtful, but hopeful. "Who would steal a squirrel?" "A criminal," said Flora. The criminal element spoke often and passionately about the nefarious activities that every human being is capable of. Not only did it insist that the human heart was dark beyond all reckoning, it also likened the heart to a river. And further, it said, if we are not careful, that river can carry us along in its hidden currents of want and anger and need, and transform each of us into the very criminal we fear. The human heart is a deep, dark river with hidden currents, Flora said to her father. Criminals are everywhere. Her father tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. "I wish I could disagree with you, but I can't." Ulysses sneezed. "Bless you," said her father. "I'm not leaving him," said Flora. Alfred T. Slipper took his parakeet Dolores with him everywhere, sometimes even to the offices of the Paxatucket Life Insurance Company. "Not without my parakeet," that's what Alfred said. "Not without my squirrel," said Flora. If her father recognized the sentence, if the words reminded him of their time together reading about Incandesto, he didn't show it. He merely sighed. "Bring him in, then," he said. But keep the lid on the shoebox." Ulysses climbed into the shoebox, and Flora dutifully lowered the lid on his small face. "Okay," she said, "all right." She climbed out of the car, and then she stood and looked up at the Giant Donut sign. "Giant Donuts inside!" The sign screamed in neon letters, while an extremely large donut disappeared over and over again into a cup of coffee. But there was no hand on the donut. Who, Flora wondered, is doing the dunking? A small shiver ran down her spine. What if we are all donuts just waiting to be dunked, she thought. It was the kind of question that William Spiver would ask. She could hear him asking it. It was also the kind of question that William Spiver would have an answer for. That was the thing about William Spiver. He always had an answer, even if it was an annoying one. "Listen to me," she whispered to the shoebox. "You are not a donut waiting to be dunked. You are a superhero. Do not let yourself be tricked or fooled. Remember the shovel. Keep an eye on George Buckman." Her father got out of the car. He put his hands in his pockets and jingled his change. "Shall we?" he said. "Stall. Delay. Obfuscate." "Let's," said Flora. And that is the end of Chapter 28. Tomorrow we're going to be reading Chapter 29 called Coochie Coo. And I will say some action is coming up in this story, and one of my favorite chapters actually takes place in the giant donut. As always, if you have any predictions, comments, or questions about this book, Flora and Ulysses, please leave them in the comment section below, and I will see you in the next video. Bye, friends.